Welcome back. I am here with David Flin. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk about his firsthand account of his experiences in the Falkland War, which are fascinating. David, welcome and thank you for sharing this experience.
No problem.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Right. Oh, it's a fairly lengthy story. Started off when I was 16, I joined the Royal Marines. It seemed like a good idea at the time. That was back in 1969. I was in the Marines for 13 years, up until 1982. During that time, I did this and that, some good bits, some a little less good. I did a couple of tours of Northern Ireland during the Troubles, which was a whole bunch of not fun.
I was actually thinking about that because you were like basically in the Royal Marines during probably the most active part of that whole situation. I mean, if you don't mind, I'd love like learning more about it and be as free as you can, because this is more about fascination and like that. Because yeah, go ahead.
Not a problem. As I say, I did 2 tours of Northern Ireland. I was also over in Dhaka when the country there changed its name from East Pakistan to Bangladesh during the Bangladeshi independence back in 71. The ship I was on was near, and when the things kicked off, Marines from the ship were sent to the embassy there to make sure that it didn't spill over into there. So I got a front seat view of Bangladeshi independence. And I did 3 months in 76 in Lebanon during the Civil War there in Beirut, which not fun. But on the plus side, I got paid to learn to ski up in northern Norway. I spent a couple of years over in Nepal recruiting for the British Army, which was a wonderful place, lovely people. Shame I had to leave, but so pluses and minuses. Come 1982, and then there was the Falklands.
You deployed to the Falklands?
I was indeed, yes.
Oh my Lord!
Commanded a troop, number 2 troop, Kilo Company, 42 Commando. We went down south, did what had to be done. We took Mount Harriet there, and while I was busy making sure that my boys were undercover, I forgot to be undercover myself. An artillery shell went off fairly close to me, and that was the end of my interest in the Falklands. Fairly badly injured. Quite luckily, by chance, there was a nurse at the aid station who patched me up and kept me together. Was with me on the hospital ship on the way back, and by the time we'd reached England, we were engaged. So Mills and Boon rejected the concept as being too unrealistic.
I have so many questions. I mean, you just unpacked so many different things. Okay, let's go to the Falklands conflict first. So how did as it started building up? If you just give, because again, there's the majority of my audience is American, so if you could give them a sense of even the broader strategic picture. How did it start? How did the British get involved? Because Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister at the time, right?
That's correct, yes. During her time, Falklands is a British territory. It had been established way back in the 1833, I think it is, but thereabouts, when it was at the time an uninhabited rock. British settlers settled there, stayed there. Argentina, come 1982, was having economic difficulties. It had a military dictatorship running things. There was lots of internal problems. In order to distract from the internal problems, they decided to claim what they called the Malvinas, what we call the Falklands, and it invaded with a large force. That was back in right at the start of April 82.
At the time, were there any British forces on the island when they invaded?
There was a troop. There was about 30 Royal Marines as a nominal guard on there.
And roughly how many forces did they invade with?
They, in the thousands, the net Argentine military presence at the end when we went down south was about 10,000. I'm not sure how many actually invaded at the time, but it was in the thousands. That little one-sided number-wise.
So you were outnumbered, at least the Royal Marines on the island, about 30, and you were like thousands of Argentine forces. So they land on the island, or they're making their way to the island, and then what happens after that?
What happened was they made their way to the island. They captured the key points on the island. They captured the Marines that were there, the governor of the island. Basically, once it became clear that further resistance was just going to lead to deaths, issued a surrender, and the Argentines captured the island back on the first or the second day of that invasion.
And how many British citizens were on the island, and were there any Argentine or Argentine, and I'm going to pronounce that, citizens? Like, what was that mix like?
Population of the Falklands at the time was around between 2,000 and 3,000. The Falklands itself consists of 2 islands. It's roughly the size of Wales, so it's pretty empty. I'm trying to think what in America would be about the size of Wales. Maine.
Okay. Yeah.
So you're looking at about a population of 3,000 for the state of Maine.
And then what was the composition? Were they all British citizens? Was a small percentage British
citizens? They've since had referendums on whether they want to be British, whether they want to be Argentinian, whether they want to be themselves. 3 people voted for being Argentinian. The rest voted that they wanted to be British. I mean, it was, if you just saw the numbers, you'd think this is a fixed result, but they're British citizens. It's been British since the 1830s. Quite frankly, they feel more British than most British people.
Are they mostly English speaking, or do they speak Spanish?
It's entirely English speaking. I mean, heavily dialect, but that you expect. Yeah, it's not Spanish speaking in any size, shape, or form.
Okay, so it would be like Mexico trying to come in, and I'm trying to think of, this is a terrible analogy, but like seize like a town in Minnesota or something like that. Not, in Texas, there's plenty of Hispanics and things like that, so that wouldn't necessarily translate. But it was like just a pure British population where they just came and seized territory. It's
purely British. It's odd because it's an island that's 8,000 miles from Britain and only a couple of hundred from Argentina, which, of course, is why Argentina thinks it belongs to them. I mean, my personal view is that it belongs to whoever the people who live there want to belong to. If they want to be Falkland Islanders with independence, good luck to them. If they want to be British, good luck to them. If they want to be Argentine, good luck to them.
Okay. All right. So the Argentines send a huge force. They take over the island in about 2 days. Then what?
Then basically they set up camp. All hell breaks loose back in England, where, first of all, people are trying to find out where the Falklands are. Okay. For most people, you say, before 1982, if you said the Falklands, they would have shrugged their shoulders and said, what? Where? No one really knew where it was. They found it on a map, but the principle had been that it had been taken by force. There had been a defence. It was an invasion to capture sovereign territory, which is strangely relevant today.
Right, exactly. Although the Russians have more in common ethnically with the Ukrainians than the Argentines had with the British or the people of that island.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So all hell breaks loose in England. Then what?
Then the political decision is made that to send a task force to retake the islands and basically to demonstrate to Argentina that Britain is serious about this. While the task force is being formed, which was done in a great deal of hurry, the invasion was on the 1st of April. By the 3rd of April, we were sailing. So you can imagine how quickly it was. One of the people from my troop had got married on the 31st of March, was about to go on his honeymoon there when it was oh, no, you're not. You're coming down south with us. He whinged the entire time throughout the campaign that he thought he had better things to do, fight on a windswept rock in the middle of the bloody Atlantic. But, that's the job.
Soldiers and Marines do and say,
he
right?
He whinged the entire time, but then everyone whinged about everything. But while we were sailing south, the United Nations, all the statesmen around the world were busy trying to find a peaceful solution to this all, which founded on the rock that Britain's red line was there can be no talks while the Argentines have got a military presence on the island. The Argentine military forces have to leave before we were prepared to talk about anything. And the Argentines said that we have taken this island belongs to us. We will keep our military forces on this place if we want to. And there were lots of talks. Haig, one of the American, I think
General Haig, probably the Secretary of State at the time, I bet.
Secretary of State did a lot of incredible work trying to bridge the gap, trying to get an agreement to do it, which all foundered basically because the two red lines couldn't meet. So down south we trundled. Public back home were getting a bit upset because they didn't realise that it takes time for ships to sail 8,000 miles.
8,000 miles. Now, were you on a aircraft carrier? Like, how did you get down there?
I travelled on the luxury liner, Canberra. The formation of the task force was whatever was available. Things like aircraft carriers, they were warships, and so they didn't want lots of Marines clogging the place up. We had 2 specialist ships for carrying Marines, Fearless and Intrepid, what they call commando ships. They were designed to transport carriers. They could carry 2 battalions, 1 battalion each. Fortunately, there were 3 commando battalions and 2 paratroop battalions that were going down, and 5 into 2 doesn't go. So various liners were requisitioned to help carry. There was Canberra. Gander went down as a hospital ship. There was one of the Queen Elizabeth liner, but basically luxury liners were requisitioned and went down.
Now, who crewed the ships? Like, did you have civilians crewing the ships?
The standard people who were there normally, the civilian crews.
So the British government commandeered a luxury liner and had the crews, civilians who were employed by a luxury liner, steer themselves into a war zone. Is that correct?
That basically, yes. I mean, they got rid of.
This is what I love about the British. This is what I love about the British. It's just the stiff upper lip, right?
But the people actually driving the ship were from the merchant navy. Were basically, well, there's no basically. They were civilians who were doing a job. To be fair, they did get extra pay for it, but yeah, it was different for them.
were they whinging too, or were they okay?
They were okay. I think they were quite excited at being part of something quite special, and of course, they didn't really have the experience or the knowledge to know what being in a war zone might actually mean.
Yeah, my first thought was artillery from the shoreline, going after them, but they probably didn't even enter into their heads.
Yeah, I mean, that they didn't. They were basically just continuing to do their job of moving people from one place to another. It's just that this time, the place that they were going to wasn't quite as secure as most. But
okay.
So we trundled on down southwards while Haig was trundling between London, New York, and Buenos Aires to try and sort something out, and ending up failing. Then we reached the Falklands, and that's when that's when the war actually started proper, as far as we were concerned.
Okay, so you're on this luxury cruise liner.
Yeah.
How do you make the transition from that cruise liner to land?
Right. The actual landings were on the first day were done by the 2 battalions that were in the specialist ships for them. All very D-Day style, landing craft, special forces going ahead to clear the beaches, make sure that sites overlooking the beach weren't occupied. It was pure D-Day. I missed all of that because I was there was room for 2 battalions, and the battalion I was in wasn't required.
So two
as battalions, we call them commandos, but it's easier for people to understand.
Okay, so 2 commandos / battalion equivalent units of Royal Marines seize certain points.
Seize the landing sites.
And then what about the paratroopers? What are the
by civilized boats, and basically got ferried ashore, where we promptly did our imitation of moles and dug in, because we knew that air attacks would be coming fairly soon. That was the next phase of the war.
Who had air superiority at the time?
It's difficult to say. We had
the fact that you said
Harriers, but they were relatively close at hand. They had a lot more planes, but they had to come all the way from Argentina across. So flight time numbers-wise, it probably was roughly 50-50. They could do a surge and get a lot of planes in over the area, but they couldn't keep them up for long. Our Harriers were, because they were on the carriers, which were kept a bit further out, and there was a lot of argument afterwards, did they need to be so far back? But hindsight's a wonderful thing. And the reasoning at the time was, if we lose a carrier, we're stuffed.
Yeah, so I don't even think hindsight is 2020 is an excuse. I mean, I think any competent military commander would make that decision, every single day. Well, the other thing I think that's important for folks to understand is, in every conflict that I think the U.S. has ever been involved in, when there was air power, maybe with the exception of World War I, we've always had air superiority. So the U.S. military is not accustomed to looking up at the skies, because we always control them. What's interesting about the Falklands, or the Falkland Island campaign, is that it was, even 50-50 is a completely different experience. It changed your tactics. The fact that you dug in, not because you were worried about the infantry coming in, it was mainly because of air power, is something that U.S. military officers don't even have to think about. So, okay, so you get there, you dig in, then what?
Right. There's the lengthy process that, in order to... the landing was done in San Carlos Bay, which is right over on the left-hand side of the island. The capital and the important part is right on the other side of the island. So
when you say left-hand side of the island,
the west. We landed on the west side of the main island. Stanley and all the important settlements are over on the east side of the island.
And the west side, that's closest to
one that's closest
Argentina?
to Argentina.
Okay. All right. Sorry. I just wanted to establish that for the audience.
Yes. So the reason we landed there was simply that the first priority was to get the troops ashore safely. American military strategy at the time would have been to basically to do an opposed landing at Stanley and have the whole thing done and dusted within a couple of days. It would have meant heavier casualties for those days, but it would be all over quickly. The American military, of course, have the firepower and the resources to enable that to work. We didn't have that, so we had to land where they weren't, which meant right on the other side of the island. And we didn't have enough helicopter lift, so we were going to have to carry it, pick it up, pick up the stuff and walk across. The Falkland Islands is a peat bog. There are mountains here and there.
Oh, memories. Like, it's infantry shit. It's infantry shit. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's absolutely. Tanks sink. You can't operate anything other than very light tanks in there because they sink. Trucks sink. There's only a handful of tracks around the place. You walk across the island, and for the most part, every step you sink between knee and ankle deep into the muck, and you move on.
What was the weather like, temperature-wise, precipitation?
It's winter. There's nothing between you and the Antarctic.
Cold is extremely cold.
When it wasn't raining, it was snowing, and you got winds. The winds typically come straight off the Antarctic at winter. Yeah.
Well, again, that's also important to establish is that since this was in April when this was happening, you are moving into, because you're in the southern hemisphere, into winter. Yeah. So again, just for the audience
you're coming into winter.
There's so many factors that people who are looking at the outside aren't even considering. Like when I went to this interview, I wasn't even considering that because I'm like, it's kind of springtime because I'm used to the northern hemisphere, but you're fighting in the southern hemisphere and you're moving into winter. Okay, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no worries. So the first thing that we had to do was to get the supplies from the ships to the shore. Meantime, the Argentinian Air Force, realizing that we were trying to get stuff shore, sent in waves to attack the ships in San Carlos Bay. The Royal Navy basically placed a string of ships as a defensive shield around them. The Argentinian pilots had to choose between either attacking the warships or flying over the warships to attack the merchant ships busy unloading. They decided primarily to attack the warships on the basis that flying over a warship that's shooting at you isn't a whole bunch of fun. So that they dealt with that, which was strategically
stupid.
If they took out the ships, the stores, game over. There's nothing much you can do if you haven't got food or weapons. You're not going to do a lot of good. So that was that phase of the operation. San Carlos Bay became imaginatively known as Bomb Alley, and it was busy basically getting shores to land, dodging aircraft whizzing overhead, and trying not to think about what was going to come up. So that was that phase of the operation. By this point, the viewers back home were getting bored. So
sounds familiar. Only it's probably worse nowadays. But go on.
So there was prompting from on high to Brigadier Thompson, who was in command of the Marines and Paras who were leading it, to get a move on, and he was. You don't get to be a brigadier by being a shrinking violet. And he basically said he'll go when he's ready to go.
All right, just to stop right here, just to give folks a sense of the scale. So there were 5 commandos, which was 5 battalions of Marines.
Five commandos, about 3,000 troops in the Marines and paratroopers.
Oh, that's everything. So
so that was there. You have a similar sort of number crewing the ships, and there was a couple of extra units coming along. The Scots and Irish Guards, Gurkhas, were coming along, but they hadn't arrived as yet. But that was another brigade that was coming along later. 2
battalions of paratroopers, 3 battalion equivalents of Marines.
That's correct. That was the fighting strength. Plus, of course, all the artillery and engineering support and all the rest. There were about 5,000 ground troops in total at that time, taking all into account.
Okay, all right.
1,000 Argentine troops who had 2 months to prepare positions.
Okay, so just to give the audience some perspective, you were an attacking force on an island. Yep. So kind of an amphibious sort of campaign, attacking an enemy at 1 to 2 odds, whereas the doctrinal requirement for an attacker in order to succeed is usually 3 to 1, and that does not include amphibious operations, which you would, if you look at D-Day, it was probably much higher than that ratio, at least. Yeah, Americans, Canadians, and Brits to Germans at the time. Okay, so that's so the Brits are attacking at 1 to 2 odds on an island with subarctic temperatures, heading into winter. And did the paratroopers did they do any like drops or anything like that on the island?
No, it was it was purely coming in by drops in high winds onto an island. Not a great idea.
I didn't think so, but I didn't want to presume, because there have been many dumb things that have happened, right? Okay.
And landed. So once we'd got our kit ready and all the stuff we needed, we started moving from one side of the island towards the other.
On foot.
On foot, carrying all that we needed. We started off with carrying about 120 pounds of equipment, because there was a helicopter shortage. That there weren't enough helicopters to supply what we needed. There weren't any trucks that could work. So if we wanted it, we carried it. It's that simple. The helicopters were busy shifting artillery around, because the only way the artillery could move was being picked up by a helicopter and put where it wanted, and artillery shells and all the rest. The foot sloggers got to do their foot slogging.
Okay, so when you first got out of your hole and you had to execute your first movement, how many this is what's weird about. So the American audience is used to miles. The American military audience would be used to kilometers, which makes sense, right? Because everything's divisible by 10. It's easier to bracket your artillery when you could just do that math. But it sounds like the British military at the time, you guys are still using like the mile system and things like that, right?
Yes.
Let's talk in miles. Let's talk in miles. Okay, so your first movement, like how far was it? And at like what period did you move at night? Were you moving during the day?
We moved at night.
That's key. That's key, because people are thinking daytime, and there's reasons that you would only move at night. Okay, so you're walking through effectively a peat bog in semi-Arctic conditions. You're carrying a kit of how many pounds?
120 pounds.
120 pounds? Okay, so you're carrying a kit of like a small adolescent boy on your back through a peat bog, wet conditions. It's raining, sometimes snowing, at night when it's coldest, going into a subarctic winter. Okay, your first night, how far are you moving?
We were doing about a mile an hour.
Okay.
Right, which upset the people back in Whitehall, because they pointed out that Royal Marine training. Part of the qualifying course is that you can do 30 miles in 8 hours in full kit. Oh, why are you only doing 1 mile an hour? What's going on? Are you all unfit? And fortunately, me and my boys didn't get to hear any of this until after the event.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
well, I mean, it's obviously you have effete politicians who've never rucked in their entire lives, just sitting there looking at. Look, I mean, I've dealt with tanks and mud, and like even in training, it's in rural Kentucky, this red clay that just infests everything. It gets in your head. Like it's not even when there's no threat, right? But even in kind of 30 degrees Fahrenheit kind of conditions where it's cold and it's wet and the mud just gets into everything. You can't be clean. Sorry, I'm probably bringing back some memories. I'm sorry. Yeah. But it gets in your head. So I can't quite convey to the audience and you can't quite convey to me either, because it's, unless you've been through it, it's hard to grasp and to fully, because you're feeling like I'm feeling the mud in my gut when you're talking about it, but yeah. I didn't even deal with the entire other dimension that there were aircraft overhead. And by the way, I didn't mention you were doing this at night. And at the time, did you even have night vision yet? Was that even invented?
Night vision goggles were around. We didn't have them.
I figured it'd be something like that.
We were relying on the Mark 1.
Okay, so you're probably, I mean, again, that's why you have the mud, you have the cold, you have the 120 pounds on your back, and you're moving at night without night vision goggles. So you probably have some, like, you're probably red flashlights. You're using like red flashlights at the time?
No, I mean, just starlight, moonlight. It's good enough.
And you're just like literally probably within an arm's length of the guy in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to get too close, because
bunched up, right?
If they slow down, you bump into them, and if you bump into them, you fall over, and there's much swearing and imprecations going on. So you keep a couple of yards between you and the chap in front. You assume that the guy right at the front is going in the right direction. You frequently make comments to the effect of, you're going the wrong way.
Are you moving? Again, another important question. I'm asking the questions that most people who've never done this kind of stuff would ask, right? So I can't imagine there's a lot of infrastructure or roads in the place where you landed. So you probably have to use ravine. Like, what terrain are you moving through?
Oh, peat bogs. You've got 3 bits of terrain in the Falklands. You have the peat bog, which is the majority of it. You have the mountains, which basically stick up out of peat bogs, and you have the tended area where the sheep villages and the like are, where you've got the tracks between the villages. But most of the vast majority of what we was walking on was peat bog. It led later on to the problem of trench foot, because of course
I was thinking exactly that. That was going to be my next question.
And the service issue boots weren't very good. Speak to anyone my generation and say the word boots to them, you'll get a emotional response. They leaked.
Which is surprising, because I mean we're just Britain, right? England, like it's not a dry place. Like, no, you would think that would be one thing that the Brits would have solved.
Luckily, people in my troop, we had all bought our own boots that were secure, that were good. We made sure that there was. One of the last things I did before leaving England was to buy up a whole bunch of extra boots just in case, decent boots, so that my people would have boots that didn't leak.
At the time, what was your rank and how many people were you?
I was a lieutenant.
An officer, okay. So you have a
Yeah,
platoon.
junior officer. I started off being, when I joined up, I was an ordinary Marine. I made it up to sergeant. If I'm honest, I was happiest at sergeant. A couple of years before all this kicked off, I'd been commissioned and become an officer. So I was a fairly elderly lieutenant at the grand old age of 29.
Yeah, I'm sure your men appreciated it, though, having had the experience and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
But yes, so anyway, to get back to the story, there we were trundling along from the west side of the island towards the east side of the island. Mount Kent came along. The first action was at Goose Green, which was a para thing, which was off to the south.
Tough.
And
it was tough,
no
right?
one ever really knows why Goose Green. It would have been so much simpler just to leave a small screening force there. It was out of the way. It was miles from anywhere. It was doing nobody any harm. And the only thing we can think of why Goose Green was that people wanted a victory back home, and it was nothing's happening, let's do something. That's the only reason we can think of that makes any sort of sense.
The U.S. military did stupid stuff like that at the very beginning of in Afghanistan. So I totally get it. Yeah, but it was like heavy, like that was a rough day for the Paris, wasn't it?
It was, yes. It was 13, I think it was, killed doing it, including the colonel of the unit. It was a tough one. They had to, basically, it was they had to cross a very narrow isthmus to get to the position, so they couldn't flank or spread out or do anything. It was all they could do was a frontal assault through this narrow thing. Once they got past that, they could then do flanking maneuvers and basically take out the strong points one by one. But until they did that, they were screwed. But which was why I still wonder what on earth was going through the strategist's heads at the time, because, as I say, there was nothing there.
Well, it sounds like there was enemy there. So
yeah, but they weren't going anywhere. They weren't going to be able to do anything. Yeah, if they're there, leave them there, keep them cooped up. But I'm not a general, so there was obviously bigger minds than mine that worked out why it was a good thing. We got to Mount Kent. The SAS, our special forces, reconnoitred Mount Kent and reported back that it was empty.
Those last words.
Yes, tell me about it. So there were a couple of helicopters that were in the vicinity. They diverted the helicopters to the nearest troops, which happened to be my troop. So we all piled into these two helicopters. There was 35 of us in two helicopters rated for 10 people, and basically flew to land on Mount Kent to make sure that we had a presence there, because the SAS had reported it empty. Imagine our surprise when it wasn't. There were in actual fact a half battalion of Argentine troops there, which
250 men, 250 men,
about 250 men. There were 35 of us. Fortunately, they assumed that helicopters coming towards them were
friendly,
were Argentine, were friendly. They didn't worry too much. When they saw that it was enemy troops, they did the sensible thing from our point of view, which was turn and run. I think they thought that this was the start of something big and not that this was all of us. But by bluff and good judgment, we took the mount.
Did anyone resist, or did the whole half battalion retreat?
They basically ran. We took a number of prisoners from it, of people who were basically asleep and didn't wake up in time. But by the time they're sort of getting up and getting boots on, you don't run anywhere in the Falklands without boots. It was that they were looking at the wrong end of a gun and decided that surrender was a sensible option at this point. But most of them just turned and ran.
By the way, going back to terrain, were there trees? Was it wide open? Like what?
Scrub bushes, basically. Those horrible little thorn bushes were the most common types.
So basically, you're walking around, you're picking this crap out of your arms and like legs, these thorns. There's mud everywhere. You smell like a goat. You're just cranky. It's cold. It's raining. Okay, sorry. I just want to reestablish, because we're losing some of that.
Yeah. So anyway, we'd taken Mount Kent. The Special Author Service, Special Air Service, had got back to base, and they filed their report there. And of course, that's the report that got accepted. So if you read up about Mount Kent on Wikipedia, the story is the version that they gave, which was effectively they'd driven them off, and we took possession over from them.
Wait. So the SAS claims that they drove the battalion, half battalion, off the hill, even though they reported there was nothing there.
Having reported that there was nothing there, the report got modified to they drove them off, and then we came along and took over from them. And it's a whole bunch of lies, but they got their report in first, and so that's the official version. Gentle reader, the moral of this story is that that official histories aren't necessarily always 100% accurate.
Wow.
But yes, the view of the quality of the SAS in my troop went markedly down at this point. We sort of had a low opinion to that which the public generally has of their exceptional professionalism. But, you know, they're the most highly trained authors around, so...
Okay, so you seize Mount Kent, then what?
We're taking Mount Kent, which, to set the scene, it's a isolated mountain in the middle of a large plain, so whoever controls Mount Kent can dominate the area. We were relieved from there a short while later by a detachment of Gurkhas, which, always nice to meet Gurkhas in the field. They're wonderful folk to have on your side. But
probably the best soldiers in the world, right?
Light infantry, yeah. They have their limitations because of the educational system back in Nepal. When it comes to dealing with complex technology, not so great, simply because they don't have the educational background that people in the West growing up familiar with. Tough as nails, happy, brave as a lion. They tend to be fairly straight line. If you give them an order, they will carry it out. They won't necessarily say, no, that's completely stupid, we're not going to do that. If you say, there's a machine gun nest, 3 of you charge, they'll cheerfully do that.
That sounds like U.S. Marines. Got it.
Yeah.
U.S. Marines. That's the U.S. Marines. Okay.
But we rejoined our commando and moved on. The next phase of the battle, there's a ring of hills overlooking Stanley itself. There's 3 separate peaks to there.
Stanley being the main city.
Stanley is the main city. It is now, it was made this year, it's officially now a city. God knows it's a city of about 1,800 people, which is, it's barely bigger than a village, but, you know, but Stanley is the main settlement in there. More than half the population of the Falklands live there. So we were coming to the mountains that overlooked that. Longdon, Twin Sisters and Harriet, running from north to south. there. So the next phase of the battle of the campaign was to take these three positions, which were to be done at night.
Now, how did you get from Mount Kent to your next spot? Did you walk?
Yeah.
You only get to use the helicopter when they fly you into danger, into an occupied mountain. I got it.
Yeah, helicopters were precious, all the more so because a lot of reinforcement helicopters were coming down south on the Atlantic conveyor, which had got hit by an Exocet and sunk. And so most of the helicopter support that was coming was lost at sea.
And for the audience that's not familiar with weaponry, it's an Exocet missile, right?
Yes, an anti-ship missile, launched anti-ship missile, hit Atlantic conveyor, and it sank, taking with it the helicopters that were coming to help us with our logistics.
Now, at this point in time, had you lost any men, either injury or trench foot or anything like that?
We'd had one injury there. It was walking wounded. He was staying with us. We hadn't suffered any loss of firepower, but we did. He had a shoulder wound, which meant that he couldn't fire the anti-tank missiles that we were carrying, the Milan early version javelins. Because of his bad shoulder, he couldn't fire it, and I still think that he did it deliberately to get out of carrying the damn thing.
So how did he hurt his shoulder? It's just not the enemy, not from enemy action.
I've no idea how he did it. It wasn't a bullet wound. It could have been anything. To be honest, when bullets are flying, you tend not to notice too much other than what you immediately need to notice. He went down, he got back up again. Whether it hurt his shoulder in the falling, whether something had bounced off his shoulder, a ricochet or something, I don't think he knows.
Okay. All right. So you're still 100, relatively
more
close
or less
to 100%.
strength, but with a lot more to complain about.
To get to Mount Kent, how many days had you been traveling?
It was 2.5 weeks to Mount Kent, and then another 3 days to the mountains around Stanley. So we've been going for about 3 weeks now.
So how many miles did you travel to get to Mount Kent?
It's about 50 miles.
Okay. At night. Okay. And then the next movement, you said, was about a week, few days, something like that?
About 3 days to get there. Now, Mount Harriet was right on, our objective was going to be Mount Harriet. And at this point, I should probably mention that throughout the time, the Marines and Paras, we weren't wearing helmets, we were wearing berets. The reason for this being was that in the night, the identification of the working out friend from enemy, time was critical. The decision had been made. If it was wearing a beret, it was one of ours, and if it wasn't, it was one of theirs. So in order to ease up identification, we were wearing berets. The Argentinians weren't aware of this. So if they saw a figure, they first had to try and work out if it was Argentine or British. We could tell simply from the shape of the head whether it was Argentine or British. So we were wearing our berets. And to be honest, any Marine is incredibly proud of having their berets. So it was no great hardship to do so, but it made the shape of the head distinctive. Anyway, Mount Harriet was right on the southern edge. We'd seen an Argentine patrol come out from there. It passed through a minefield. There were lots of minefields laid about, and we watched it taking the safe route through the minefield, which meant that we now knew a safe route through the minefield, which enabled us to get gave us a route to get from the front of there to the flank rear. So basically, rather than attacking straight, heading straight eastwards into the main defences, we were able to send 2 companies right round to the south so that we could have actually approach heading northwest into the rear flank of them. So we were able to get into a position to take the island. We had 1 troop making a lot of noise to the west while the other 2 troops moved right round the side, which it took a night to get into position. Then we had to hole up for the day and not be seen for that day. But it meant that we would be coming from a totally unexpected direction, which the next night, the attack went in. It was, I have no idea how long the attack took. It's one of those that you move, you see a strong point, you find a way of dealing with the strong point, either by calling in gunfire support from the frigate that's positioned there, or emptying your anti-tank weapons at them, or whatever. But effectively, the way we'd move forward, locate a strong point, stop behind a rock, have a cigarette, work out how we would deal with it, move on to the next one.
Clearing bunkers, just the old, like check for frat wire, toss in a grenade, and then go around the side, shoot whatever's left. Like just old school infantry tactics.
It's basically, it's very old school. People from the Pacific Islands in the Second World War would have recognized exactly what we were doing. That they would, the US Marines from there, they would, been there, done that. We were doing exactly the same thing in colder conditions than they were used to, but basically exactly the same thing. Luckily for us, the Argentine forces were brave, they were but they were incredibly inexperienced and very poorly led. There was a lot of comment about how they were cowards and all the rest of it. Nonsense. They were perfectly brave. They were conscripts. Some of them had been in the army 6 months or so. This was the first time that they hadn't even been on exercises to do things. This was all brand new. Our guys had been trained. A lot of them had been through the Troubles in Ireland, had been in situations where there was a chance that you would get. Doing it for real is the only way of getting used to doing it for real. And training is absolutely essential, because as soon as things happen for real, your brain stops working and you start doing, you default to what you've been trained to do.
Muscle memory.
And if you haven't been trained to do anything, your brain stops working and you're puzzling around for long enough that it's all over by the time you've worked out what you should do. So training was utterly key to that. And of course, doing it all at night exacerbates the difference between trained and untrained. When it's night time, when explosions are going off, when your officer is screaming nonsense, it just falls apart. We took Mount Harriet. We had 2 dead and 13 injured doing it. Well, at the time we took 2 dead and 12 injured. As soon as we cleared Mount Harriet, of course, the Argentinians knew exactly where it was. It was one of their places, so they knew the location to the meter, to the yard, and they had artillery back in Stanley. So as soon as they'd worked out that they'd lost Mount Harriet, they started shelling it, which was at about the time when I was making sure that my boys were all safely under cover. okay, right, this was where I forgot to duck, and an artillery shell went off fairly close to me. That was the end of my interest in the Falklands War. I was badly injured from that point and got, as a fact, got a helicopter ride all the way.
Yeah, I was about to ask, like, how did you get out of there? Thank God they sent a helicopter, right?
Yeah, helicopters had a priority. Artillery shells forward, casualties backwards. Anything else took pot luck. But yeah, it was well known that the quicker you can get a casualty to a place where it can be treated, the better. As I say, I was fairly badly injured at that time. Got back to San Carlos Bay, where the initial aid station was. Nurse was there patching me up. Now, by this time, I was completely dosed up to the eyeballs with morphine as a painkiller, and I wasn't really paying any attention to much of what was going on. But I'm told that I had dry socks for my troop in my pockets and pack, and I was insistent that they had to give the socks to my troops. You know, well, in that sort of state, to focus on one thing. You grasp one thing and you stick with it like a bulldog with its teeth in. And yeah, dry socks, my people, please, that way. The nurse was apparently quite impressed that even in the condition that I was thinking of my men. She helped with the patching up of me. It was at this point that I realised that she was a she, and this was unusual. Hadn't seen a woman for the last month and a half, so what with trudging all over the island, and there she was told that I was then helicoptered over to the SS Uganda, which was the designated hospital ship. She was told to basically accompany me to make sure that my inside stayed inside and didn't fall over, and basically make sure that I got to the operating theatre on Uganda. Got there, the surgeons did their stuff as best they could. One of the injuries I'd had was a bit of shrapnel had gone in the front and had lodged in my spine. So they had to cut out sort of 7 feet of intestine and then sew the ends back together. And
so you basically had an abdominal and a spinal wound.
Yeah, basically it went in the front and lodged in the back, which was no fun. If it had happened 20 years over, I'd have been a goner. Medicine had advanced to the stage that it could be dealt with. The spinal one, it was lodged in the spine. Apparently they said that they could try and take it out, but that gave a chance of cutting the spinal cord, or they could just fuse the 2 spinal elements around it and lock it in place there. So we went for that. And
so there's still a bullet in your spine?
Yeah, fragment of metal. It's quite useful insofar as I now know when there's high security at an airport, because I set off the metal detectors when they're at their most sensitive.
What kind of rounds did the Argentines use? Were they using M16s? Were they using AK-47s?
They were using exactly the same sort of weapons that we were using, 7.62. But as I say, that wasn't a bullet. It was
a fragment,
artillery shell, and I've no idea what size it was. But while they were operating on me, the nurse had stayed to make sure that I came out of surgery. While they were operating on me, Uganda set sail back home for there. So there was I stuck on Uganda. Got talking to the nurse. She made sure that the first meal that I got was onion soup. The reason for this being, we'd talked about it, and she'd said that back in the days, Vikings, if a Viking had an abdominal wound, they'd feed him onion soup. And then after feeding it, they'd sniff around the intestine. If they smelt onion, the intestine had been ruptured and had come out, and they were going to die. And if there was no onion smell, the intestine had remained intact, and so they would live. she'd explained all this, and we'd talked about that, and so she made sure that the first meal I got was onion soup for there, which appealed to my sense of humour. And long story short, by the time the ship reached England, we were engaged.
That's a great story. And are you still married?
Unfortunately, she died back in 2002, breast cancer. But we had 20 wonderful years together.
That's a beautiful story, my friend.
Yeah, but Mills and Boon rejected it for some reason. They said it was unrealistic. I've done a couple of stories for Mills and Boon. I proposed this one as a plot line for them, but they said, nah, we don't. No, this is so. Yeah, the story of Alison and I getting together is too unrealistic, even for Mills and Boon.
Well, usually life imitates art, right? Like this is the whole stranger than fiction sort of story.
Absolutely. Well, fiction has to make sense. Real life doesn't necessarily need to do so. But
but that's like a picture perfect Hollywood sort of ending where you're just like, come on, that can't be. No way that happened.
But yes, it was so perfect. But yeah, so lost 7 feet of intestine, gained a back wound and a wife. So that was my Falklands War.
Oh, that was a fantastic story. So thank you, David. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you in the next episode.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.